For 3 years, I drove my mother to every single chemotherapy appointment. For 3 years, I slept on a fold-out cot in her guest room so I could hear her if she called out in the night. For 3 years, I watched my own life go quiet. The promotion I didn't chase, the apartment lease I didn't renew, the man I loved who eventually stopped waiting. My brother, meanwhile, was building a deck on his house in Phoenix and posting pictures of his kids at the community pool. He flew in 4 times. 4 times in 3 years. Each visit lasted a weekend, maybe less. He'd arrive with flowers, make my mother laugh, and leave Sunday afternoon with a hug and a promise to call more often. When she passed, on a Tuesday morning in October, the leaves just starting to turn outside her bedroom window, I was holding her hand. He wasn't there. He'd flown back to Arizona the Friday before because his youngest had a soccer tournament. My name is Natalie Cross, and I was 38 years old when I learned that the people who love you most can still leave you feeling completely invisible. My mother's name was Joanne. She was stubborn and warm and funny in a dry, unexpected way that would catch you off guard. She made the best biscuits I've ever eaten, kept a garden that was a little wild and completely intentional, and had opinions about everything from hospital parking fees to the way news anchors read teleprompters. She was diagnosed with ovarian cancer 2 months after her 68th birthday. Stage 3. Her oncologist at the cancer center used words like manageable and treatable, which sounded like hope, but really just meant that the fight would be long and exhausting and uncertain. I lived 40 minutes away. My brother, who I'll call Derek, lived 2 time zones away. That's not a moral failing. I understood it in the beginning. Geography is geography. But geography doesn't explain 4 visits in 3 years. Geography doesn't explain the dropped calls, the excuses, the way he'd sometimes go 2 or 3 weeks without even texting her to check in. I was the one who learned how to read her blood work. I was the one who sat through appointments with the palliative care team and asked the questions neither of us wanted to ask. I was the one who figured out which anti-nausea medication worked best for her and which one made her feel worse. Who learned to time her meals around her treatment schedule, who drove her home after infusions and sat with her while she slept. There were Tuesdays I left work at noon and didn't get home until 11 at night. There were months when I didn't have a weekend that was fully mine. I'm not saying I resented any of it. My mother was my mother. She was also my best friend in the way that some mothers and daughters become. After the difficult years, after the growing up, after you both stop pretending, the other one is something she's not. Caring for her wasn't a sacrifice I calculated. It was just what I did, because I couldn't imagine not doing it. But I would be lying if I said it didn't cost me anything. I'd be lying if I said there weren't nights when I drove home so tired I had to stop at a gas station just to splash cold water on my face. I'd be lying if I said I never cried in a hospital parking garage, alone in my car, just to get it out of my system before I went back in with a smile. Derek called more toward the end. I'll give him that. Once it became clear that we were in the final chapter, he called almost every day. He said he felt helpless being so far away. He said he wished he could be there more. I told him I understood, because I did, and also because I was too tired to be angry at him and too focused on my mother to spend the energy. She passed peacefully. Which is a strange phrase that doesn't fully account for what peaceful actually looks like. There was no dramatic final moment, no last words delivered with perfect clarity. She'd been unconscious for almost 2 days. I was sitting in the chair beside her bed, half asleep, when her breathing simply stopped. I held her hand for a long time after. I called Derek, he cried on the phone. He was on the first flight out the next morning. The funeral was a week later. Neighbors came, her friends from the garden club. A few cousins I hadn't seen in years. People said the things people say, and most of them meant it. My mother had a way of making people feel genuinely cared for, and the turnout reflected that. Derek gave a beautiful eulogy. He talked about her laugh and her biscuits, and the way she always knew when something was wrong, even if you hadn't said a word. I sat in the front row, and nodded along and tried not to think about the fact that he'd been absent for most of the last 3 years. 2 weeks after the funeral, we gathered at the office of my mother's attorney for the reading of the estate. I hadn't thought much about the will. That sounds strange, maybe. But it's the truth. I'd been so focused on the logistics of grief. The death certificates, the utility accounts, the calls to cancel her magazine subscriptions, that I hadn't spent a lot of time imagining what the will would say. My mother wasn't wealthy, but she owned her home outright, had a modest investment account, and had been careful with money her whole life. I assumed things would be split down the middle, maybe with some small personal items left to specific people. Derek arrived at the attorney's office in a blazer, which I noticed because he never wears blazers. He seemed composed in a way that struck me as slightly performative, though I told myself I was being uncharitable. The attorney, a quiet, precise man named Mr. Holloway, opened the file, cleared his throat, and began reading. The early sections were routine. Specific items of sentimental value to various relatives, charitable donations to the local library, and her church. Then came the distribution of the estate. The house, Derek. The investment account, Derek. The savings, Derek. I sat completely still. The room was small, just the two of us and the attorney. But the silence felt enormous. I felt my hands go still in my lap. Mr. Holloway finished reading and closed the folder, and for a moment no one said anything. Derek looked at the table. He didn't look at me. I could feel the shape of it settling over me. Not rage. Exactly, but something harder and quieter than rage. Something that lives below the surface of anger and doesn't have a clean name. Then I reached into my bag. I had carried the envelope for 2 weeks. I found it 10 days after her death, tucked inside a recipe box on the second shelf of her kitchen cabinet. The one above the coffee maker, the one I'd opened 100 times looking for something else and never noticed it before. A white envelope, sealed, with my name written on the outside in her handwriting. Below my name, in smaller letters, she'd written, "Read this after." I hadn't known what that meant at the time I found it, after what, but I'd kept it. Something told me to keep it until after the will was read. I couldn't explain why, even now, I just felt it. I placed the envelope on the table. Derek finally looked up. "What is that?" he asked. "Mom left this for me," I said. "She asked me to open it after the will was read." Mr. Holloway looked at the envelope and then at me. "Would you like to do that now?" I nodded. I broke the seal. Inside were 2 things. A handwritten letter, 5 pages in my mother's familiar, slightly cramped script, and a smaller envelope, sealed, with Mr. Holloway's full name and the name of his firm written on the outside. I handed the second envelope to him. His eyebrows rose slightly, but he took it. I started reading the letter. I read it silently at first, and then, because my hands were shaking and the room was completely quiet, I started reading it out loud. "Natalie, if you're reading this, then you've just sat through the reading of my will, and I imagine you're feeling something I don't have a good word for. I hope you'll give me a few minutes to explain. I made a decision that probably looks like a punishment. It isn't. I need you to hear that first, before anything else. You have cared for me for 3 years with a steadiness and a grace that I have tried to find the right words for and cannot. There was not a single appointment you missed, not a night I called out, and you didn't answer. You gave up things I know about, and things I suspect you never told me about, because you didn't want me to feel guilty. You will never fully understand what that meant to me, because there are no adequate words. I watched you become someone I am in absolute awe of." My throat tightened. Derek had gone very still. I kept reading. "Derek loves me. I believe that without any reservation. But love and presence are not the same thing, and I want him to understand that distinction before I'm gone. I have tried to tell him, gently and not so gently, over the years. I don't know if it got through. I hope this does. The house and the accounts I left to him are not a reward. They are a responsibility, and I left them to him because I believe that having to manage them, maintain them, make decisions about them, that work will teach him something that simply inheriting money could not. But there are things I didn't leave to him." I looked up at Mr. Holloway. He was now opening the envelope my mother had addressed to him. His expression shifted as he read. He reached into his folder, pulled out a separate document, and set it carefully on the table. 7 years ago, my mother's letter continued. I sat down with a financial advisor and made some decisions I never told either of you about. I had some money set aside from before your father died. An account that was always separate, always mine. I put it into a trust, a formal legal trust, established with Mr. Holloway's firm to be disclosed only after my will was read. The room had gone absolutely silent. The trust contains the proceeds from that original account, which I invested carefully over the years with help. I'm proud to have had the sense to ask for. It also contains the rights to a small piece of commercial property in town, the one on Maple Street behind the pharmacy. Your grandmother left it to me and I never mentioned it to anyone. I had it appraised 2 years ago. It's worth more than the house. I stopped reading. Derek said very quietly, "What?" Mr. Holloway slid the document across the table toward me. It was a trust agreement. Signed, notarized, witnessed. The name of the beneficiary was typed clearly at the top of the page. Natalie Ann Cross. My mother's letter had one more page. I am not trying to pit you against each other. I am not trying to make a point at your brother's expense. But I spent 3 years watching you carry a weight that no one asked you to carry and no one properly acknowledged. And I decided that the last thing I would do for you is make sure you were seen, not just by the people in that room, by something permanent. The trust doesn't require anything from you except to use it wisely and to know that you earned it. Not because you expected something in return, but because you showed up when it was hard and kept showing up even when it cost you. Money can be given to anyone. This was given to you. I love you more than I have ever been able to say out loud, and I am so proud of who you are. Momi folded the letter. The room was so quiet I could hear the ventilation system running in the ceiling. Derek didn't say anything for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful and a little rough. I didn't know, he said. About the property or the account. I didn't know. I know, I said. I should have been there more. I didn't answer that because it was true and it didn't need my help. Mr. Holloway gave us both time. Then he walked me through what the trust actually contained. Practically speaking, the account had grown steadily over 7 years. The commercial property generated rental income. Together, the value was significant. More than I had ever owned. More than I had ever imagined having. My mother, who clipped coupons and reused aluminum foil, and drove the same car for 14 years, had been quietly building something for me that she never once hinted at. I thought about all the appointments I'd driven her to over those 3 years. The Tuesday morning traffic on Route 9, the way she'd keep the radio on low and sometimes fall asleep in the passenger seat before we'd even left the neighborhood. The way she'd squeeze my hand in the elevator going up to the oncology floor, every single time, like we were bracing for something together. The nights I stayed late because she'd had a bad day and didn't want to be alone. The day I quit my gym membership because I couldn't figure out when I'd ever use it. The birthday dinner my partner at the time had planned for us that I canceled because she had a fever and I was scared. She had noticed every single one of those things and said nothing at the time and quietly done something about it. I didn't cry in the attorney's office. I'd cried enough in parking garages over the past 3 years. What I felt instead was something I'd never experienced quite that way before. A warmth that was also an ache, a completeness that also hurt because she wasn't there to tell her it was enough. She didn't need to do this. I wasn't keeping score. I would have driven her to every single one of those appointments, even knowing how the will would read, because she was my mother and because it was the right thing to do. But she did it anyway. Derek and I walked out of the building together. The sky was that particular shade of blue that happens in October in the Northeast. Clear and cold and completely unambiguous. We stood on the sidewalk for a moment without speaking. I should have come more, he said again. This time it didn't sound like an explanation. It sounded like something he was placing somewhere permanent. She knew you loved her, I said. She said so, That's not the same thing as being there. No, I agreed. It isn't. We didn't hug. We didn't fight. We stood there for a few more seconds, and then he said he needed to get to the airport, and I said I'd call him next week. And we went in separate directions. I sat in my car for a long time before driving. I had spent 3 years wondering, on the hard days, whether any of it was registering, whether anyone was keeping track, whether the weight I was carrying was visible to anyone other than me. I hadn't asked for credit. I hadn't expected payment, but I'd be dishonest if I said I never once, at midnight on a Tuesday, sitting in a hospital waiting room with a terrible cup of coffee, felt entirely alone in it. My mother was keeping track the whole time. Not on paper, not in words she ever said out loud, but in something more lasting than either of those things. In a decision she made quietly, when no one was watching, 7 years before I would ever need to know about it. I started the car. The commercial property on Maple Street was 4 blocks from the house I grew up in. I'd driven past it 1,000 times without thinking about it. A brick building, modest, with a dry cleaner on the ground floor and 2 office spaces above. Nothing dramatic. Just a steady, reliable piece of the town my mother had lived in for 40 years. I thought about what she'd written. This was given to you. Not because I had suffered, not as compensation for what I'd lost, but because she trusted me with it, the way you trust something to the person you believe will take care of it. I pulled out of the parking lot and drove the familiar stretch of road toward the house I'd spent so many days in over the last 3 years, the one that now technically belonged to my brother. I didn't feel bitter about that. I'm not sure I could explain exactly why, except to say that the letter had given me something the house never could have. The absolute certainty that she had seen me, that she had known what those 3 years actually cost, and that she had loved me with a precision and intentionality that went beyond anything she could have said out loud. Derek would figure out how to maintain a house he wasn't sure what to do with. He would have to make decisions about it, deal with the property taxes, eventually decide whether to keep it or sell it. That was his inheritance, and with it came its own particular kind of weight. Mine came without weight. Mine came with a letter and a piece of property, and the knowledge that my mother had spent 7 quiet years making sure I would be taken care of. There are things you do for the people you love that you never expect to be seen. Most of them stay invisible. You do them anyway, not because you're hoping someone is watching, but because the alternative, not doing them, isn't actually an option. Not for you, not with the person it's for, but sometimes the people you love are watching more carefully than you know. Sometimes what looks like silence is actually something being built, quietly and without ceremony, for the moment when you need it most. My mother didn't leave me money. She left me proof.